This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?
And by the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation. As a nonprofit, we rely on support from listeners like you. If you like what you hear, please consider a donation. To learn more and make a gift, visit us at www.gosuperior.org.
Welcome to the Lake Superior Podcast. I'm Walt Lindala.
And I'm Frida Waara. We are made stronger by story, and there's no better source than the continent's largest body of fresh water, Lake Superior.
So join us as we highlight the 5 national parks that ring this greatest of the Great Lakes, meet the people, tour the places, and learn about the projects that make these parks and body of water so remarkable.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
I'm Walt Lindala.
And I'm Frida Waara.
Welcome once again to the Lake Superior Podcast, where we talk about things going on in Lake Superior, around the Lake Superior area, the national parks, and more. And Frida, you've set up actually a pretty cool conversation for today. Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, I think we have to go back a couple of years on this story a little bit, Walt, because really good friends of mine, Jeannie Thoren and her husband, Tom Haas. I was visiting them in Duluth, and I had an opportunity because I knew Tom knew Isle Royale very intimately. He had been there over and over again, and he and Jeannie would continue to travel to Isle Royale. But I didn't know that he had over 3,000 black and white photos that he had shot of Isle Royale. And the beauty of it is they've now become a book. And oh my goodness, we've got to talk to Tom about this book.
That's right. Here to talk about the book and the adventure of taking the photos and a lot more, the author and photographer, Tom Haas. Welcome to the podcast, Tom.
Thank you for inviting me.
Glad to have you. Let's talk a little bit about Tom Haas. Tell us a little bit about your background, and then how did you get to Isle Royale, and when did you all get started in all of this?
In the 60s, mid-60s, I got on a mailing list for a conservation association position at Isle Royale, among other places I could apply for. It was an internship, more or less, and there couldn't have been many applicants because I didn't have that much photographic experience, but it requested someone with being able to point a camera and reload it, things like that, basic stuff. And the park basically said, here's the camera, here's the film, put in a 40-hour week. They really hadn't fully thought through what they would use the position for. It's modified, it's changed over the years, and it still exists. But largely they use the internship where, like on holiday days, so that if a park ranger has a day off, they won't give them a day off on a holiday, and they'll use a conservation applicant for the job.
So let's talk a little bit about the assignment, Tom. I mean, what was the assignment that you were given? You said just kind of go and take pictures. I mean, that seems pretty open-ended.
It was. The reality was that the park, they're all understaffed, and they're all stretched on budgets. And so sometimes they, grasp at, might say, straws to try and improve things for the visitor's experience. And some of them work out really well. I think there's an artist in park type of thing, or volunteer in park they call VIPs now. And basically, if you have a vision, you can sell the park on the idea of you writing music or doing poetry or taking photos. I was at the start of that trend, and so there was more leeway. Now they're a little more tied to the desks and to little hikes, not necessarily.
But Tom, we have to talk a little bit for our listeners that, everybody walks around right now with an iPhone or, a camera in their hand that's, about the size of a billfold. And you need to share with these listeners a little bit about the camera that they gave you and how much that weighed, plus a tripod, and a little bit about that film. It's crazy.
Well, the technology of the 20s and earlier was, the film was individual sheets. So if you took a picture, you were exposing a sheet of film, plastic, to a minimal amount of sunlight, basically. So it was a slow process, but the quality of the images was really great, going back to Matthew Brady in the Civil War. But you couldn't move quickly. You didn't sneak up on moose or foxes even. The fox might come up and hit you up for peanut butter.
Yeah.
And basically, they provided housing. I had to order my own food from Houghton, which was a new experience for me, because I was only about 19 at the time. But there were more seasoned rangers and part-timers who were more seasoned than I, and they kept me from drowning or getting too much in trouble.
Well, how did you move around with all of that? I mean, it's like that's a lot of equipment. That's a tricky terrain. How did you manage to do that? I mean, granted, you were an ambitious, 19-year-old, and it probably made it a little easier. But I mean, how did you get around?
Well, initially, there's no roads for cars on Isle Royale, so basically, I was on foot, or I used first year a canoe, and second year on, I acquired a collapsible kayak that was wooden frame, skin with a hull that was flexible. And they were very seaworthy. I hadn't had lunch in 6-foot seas many an occasion, with only one eye on the rogue waves. And I was just thinking today, as we're thinking about this conversation, I don't think in my 30 years that I jumped at all, barely once, perhaps. But that was fooling around. I never really got in trouble.
Well, that's a really good thing, because we need to share with our listeners the size and the type of the camera that you were using. I've got a picture of that. We'll share it on our website as well. But Tom, it's a darn good thing you didn't roll over.
Well, the boat itself was very stable, which made a huge difference. And especially early, my first year or two, made a difference in terms of the safety of the boat. It was more seaworthy than my skills. And if you're careful, you can avoid some seas in some places. It might normally be scary. And so, Lake Superior's a dangerous lake, but at the same token, it's still a lake, and it calms down most evenings. So I got used to traveling after dark and feeling more comfortable traveling 1 or 2 foot sea that's dropping and getting quieter than daylight and a 4 foot sea. But the camera was a wood framed. It's called a view camera generically, and it takes sheet film. And the typical sizes are 3 1/4 by 4 1/4, 4 by 5, 5 by 7, or 8 by 10. And I had a 5 by 7, which was converted to 4 by 5 just by changing out the film holder in the back. And so it was a hybrid, you might say. But because of the size of the film, when you enlarge the picture, it wouldn't have to be many multiples of enlargement to maintain high quality images.
Were you working primarily in black and white? Was that a decision? Was that something?
Yeah. Well, because significant on the film, first of all, black and white is much easier to develop than color. Color required temperatures to be the same throughout the process. And initially, I only had darkroom facilities in one spot in the park, and that was not enough. There wasn't enough hot water to run the color system.
Jeez.
And so everything made sense to do black and white. Plus, I'm a fairly frugal New Englander, And, and since the price of the film for myself was on my hook, I didn't have a big budget for film. Film cost 15.5 cents a 4x5 sheet, whereas 35 millimeter was about half a cent when you bought it in 100-foot rolls. And so I started out with 35 millimeter, and it just didn't seem practical to do 4x5 or color.
We're talking with Tom Haas today, who is a photographer, talking about several years, decades of photos he has taken at Isle Royale and has resulted in a book. Now, Tom, with the book, we talked earlier about you having about 3,000 images. It's been scaled down to 275-ish. How did you make those selections? How do you decide that? Is it multiple rounds? I mean, how do you get to that number?
Well, it is multiple passes, one way or the other. To organize for this project, basically filled up the attic in my little bungalow here in Duluth with images and just put aside ones that didn't make the cut, basically. And that could be someone could have their eyes closed in a portrait versus a shot where they're wide-eyed, or there could be flaws in the film. I mean, the idea was to more or less document the circumnavigation of the park waters, trip around the island, and put pictures that were either specifically from a fishing station or a camp or something that is found at that altitude. There are a lot of little microclimates at Isle Royale, and so some prints, basically like a picture of the swamp, doesn't lend itself to showing it where the ridge, where the main ridges are, a rock. The lighthouse pictures would gravitate to a location. So bulk of it was straightforward, and then you don't want to just concentrate on one spot where there's a lighthouse. You want to have all the lighthouses that by chance were photographed. And it was never a mandate. It wasn't like the park gave me specific instructions much. So I was pretty much on my own.
And you caught some of the most amazing shots of calypso orchids and skunk cabbage and marsh marigold and pitcher plants. And oh my goodness, the list is long. But Tom, you also captured some of the most legendary families at Isle Royale. And many times our visitors now that go to the park don't understand that 57 years ago, there was a vibrant fishing community and people that went all summer to earn a living by fishing those waters. Is there any of those stories that stand out in your mind?
Over time, it became pretty clear to me that everybody has had, who spent time on the water, and that water particularly, they all had close calls. They all basically put their lives on the line every time they went out on the water with their boats, and particularly in the 20s and 30s, when their boats could be overloaded with herring or trout, and they had to do all the mending of the nets and organizing herring, curing, salting. So there was a lot of things going on, and they had to be competent, basically, at all of them. And one of the challenges was to anchor nets, and you don't really see it, but the nets are set sometimes in 500 or 600 feet of water, and they're held in place by burlap sacks and old boulders. And if they aren't really careful, lowering the sacks on the side of the boat could flip or pull somebody on the line, could get entangled with the fishermen, and the fishermen would get pulled over the side. So it was not a game of golf.
I guess the question that comes to my mind is that as you've been visiting this island now for as long as you have, and you and your wife have gone there and spent time there, Is there either a favorite spot that you have, maybe a time of year to visit that really works? Because, you've got so many years of history with it. How all does this, what are some of your favorite places?
Well, basically, that's one of the key things from my side, is they're all around you. I have spent a lot of time with the tripod supporting the camera right next to the trail. And people are so intense sometimes making it to the next campground that I could reach out and touch them with just a reach without a step. And they still don't see me as they go down the trail because they're so intent on watching where their feet are going. So you can find a lot of these places everywhere. But my favorite, I pick one, would be Raspberry Island, which is right near the lodge at Rock Harbor. It has a wide variety of plant life, from things like pitcher plants and sundew insectivorous carnivores to some of the fungi, Calypso orchids, the Arethusa orchid. And because of Raspberry being off the main shore, one, it's relatively easy access because it has a dock. You can't spend the night there, but you can day trip to Raspberry. And so you can see pitcher plant and some of these more exotics. And the growing season is compacted, so they bloom later, but they stay in bloom longer. So you see more than you can sometimes on the larger islands.
One of the things I love, Tom, when you were photographing families, you were photographing a fisherman. I think about all of those great, characters. How was it? Because when people go to Isle Royale, they're not necessarily real sociable. They love to be out there and be on their own and not necessarily have a visitor. But somehow you were able to gain that friendship, and it turned into some spectacular portraits.
The goal is to get someone to relax enough for you to take their picture. And that's trust. And I gained, without being crass about it, I gained their trust somewhat deliberately by giving them copies of my photos from the first year I met somebody. Mm-hmm. When I came back the second year, I would have either sent them beforehand or brought along copies of prints of their families or their fishing place. And I'm pretty sure that almost nobody gave the fishermen, the summer residents, copies of their work. And they respected, if I was crazy, but they respected my work ethic. Because I would sometimes not think of anything about backing up and going over 15 miles after dark back to Rock Harbor, where I had a cabin to use. So I became part of their household in some respects because I was young enough to still do roofing.
Yeah.
And there's always need for roofing in those simple camps.
So when we talk about this now, you got the trust of the people that were there. They were living there. You got a rapport going with them. You got these great photos. You kept coming back year after year. You did this. You've known the island now for, since late 1960s. Can you tell me about maybe what has changed and then what has remained constant through all of that?
One thing that's been noticeable is the soil has gotten compacted where the foot trails are. So, for example, I used to run cross country, and I continued running after college. And the trails at Isle Royale were, in many areas, were not at all rocky, but they were sphagnum-less. They were springy. They were really comfortable to run on. And they were a little bit gnarly at times, of twists and turns. And so that's a change in the quality of the trail. Another is the Park Service used to be indifferent to possibly even hostile towards the summer residents. They weren't very good at communicating. Part of it was, I think, that you've got points in the career path, at least for park ranger, somewhat based on having point categories, which tended to lead some job openings that were overfilled by police mentality, I always say. That's changed and somewhat gone away, but there's still friction between some of the summer residents and the Park Service. That's kind of minor.
Tom, what do you hope is the take-home message from your book?
Well, one is you don't have to be in a rush or cover a lot of ground to see a lot. There are people get their feet bruised from trying to cover too much ground. There should pick destinations that are 3 or 4 miles apart rather than 20 miles. You don't see much if you're trying to do 20 miles in a day. That's the main difference, and I think that's underutilized.
So how can people find a copy of the book? I mean, right now it's come out. You've got these several hundred photos in it of all your years of visiting the island. How can people find it? Where's the best way to get it and get it in their hands?
We have a website, my wife and I. It's under my name, Haas Photography, and you can order online that way. I'll have more distribution as the time goes on, but we're a 2-person operation right now, and we can only do so many projects. We're both in our late 70s, so there's only so much production that comes out of it. But we're pleased with the initial flurry of activity, and we thank you guys for plugging us a little bit.
Absolutely. Every time we get a chance to talk to somebody that knows Isle Royale as well as you do, Tom, and your wife, Jeannie Thoren, it's so wonderful. And Tom and Jeannie live in Duluth, so it's not like you can actually see Isle Royale from their house, but you sure can feel it when you look out over Big Blue.
Mm-hmm. Now, Tom, we want to thank you for your opportunity, your time to spend a little time with us today to talk about the book, and hopefully some folks will give it a look and give it an order, and it's an opportunity also to experience Isle Royale without maybe making the trip, but seeing it from a different perspective. And we appreciate your time today, Tom, with us to tell us all about it.
Okay.
Tom Haas, who is photographer and author of a new book. We'll have all that information in the description here, as you can see. But, Frida, it's always interesting to talk to somebody that has made a lifetime of Isle Royale, visiting it, being on it. And, this actually, when Tom was talking, one of the things I heard was recently we spoke with John Prane, the Isle Royale guy, about Isle Royale. And he kind of said the same thing, that there's people that visit Isle Royale that try to do the whole thing in a couple of days, or 4 days, 5 days, and they don't see what's all around them. I remember from that particular conversation, he said that someone can walk right by a moose and not know it. And Tom here has the same sort of message, that's one thing he's learned of being at Isle Royale is if you go, take your time.
Yes, don't rush. And how could he rush? Walt, I remember doing the documentary on the first Artist in Residence program there, and we had a motorboat. Granted, we were carrying video equipment, and we had to carry all of the tripod and batteries. Tom's camera weighed 12 pounds. His tripod was 8. So that's 20 pounds one person, because we had Mike Settles and Bob Thompson to help haul that stuff around, and everybody else we could get with us. He was in a klepper. Anybody that's a kayaker knows this folding boat, it's kind of a really reinforced kind of canvas boat. And at one point, Tom has told me this story. He paddled from Washington Island to Rock Harbor in 18 hours. This guy was phenomenal. And he's got some health issues right now, so of course things aren't the same. But when you look back at what this lad in his 1920s, all the way into his 40s and 50s, what he and Jeannie were doing when they would be traveling on the Otter. So just understanding when he mentions very humbly that the people on the island respected his work ethic. They not only invited him into their homes, because this book has some beautiful photos of the cabins, caught them many times, husbands and wives, kind of just, wait a minute, here's a visitor. But
but it's interesting because I don't think that people have an understanding that there were people that lived there for more than just a week or two as a visit. They lived there throughout the summer season and into other when they could get the supplies. And that's an important part of the history that I don't think is talked about enough with Isle Royale. And there's an interesting look into this with Tom's book.
Yep. And if you're invited to sit and have coffee, or you're going to have a piece of cake, and you know what it took to get that coffee, to get that cake, to filter that water, all of those pieces, it comes alive in this booklet. It really does. And there's very, short narrative. Tom's not one to spend a lot on words, but the
Right.
words he chose are so carefully done that I think if you sit with this book, you'll want to go to Isle Royale.
And it's a really good that we had a chance to talk with the photographer and author Tom Haas. You can find that book out there. It's just come out in the last little while. In fact, as we're in here recording it, hold up that book so I can read the title for everybody. Isle Royale, A Photographer's Circumnavigation, 1967 to 1987 by Tom Haas. It's a big coffee table, black and white book, certainly worth checking out. And again, that information will be linked up here with our podcast description. But it's just another great example of what's out there on the Big Blue. And we appreciate all of you sticking around with us here on the Lake Superior podcast and hearing about it.
One other thing, Walt, as we get to, 7 decades on this planet, and we've had these great experiences, there's a lot of time in our life that we'd say, oh, yeah, I shoulda, woulda, coulda. But I am so grateful that Jeannie and Tom spread those tables out in the attic of their home out there in Duluth, and they started sorting this out so that we have this gift. Yeah. They had the stories. They had the photos. They're willing to share it.
That's good. That's a good way to wrap it up right there. Good opportunity to learn about Isle Royale with that book with Tom Haas, the author and photographer, joining us on the Lake Superior podcast today. That's going to do it for us. I'm Walt Lindala.
I'm Frida Waara. Thanks for listening. The National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation, NPLSF, is the only official nonprofit 501c3 fundraising partner of the National Park Service for all 5 U.S. national park sites on Lake Superior.
To learn more about NPLSF projects and programs, you can visit the website at nplsf.org or friend them on Facebook.
I'm Frida Waara.
And I'm Walt Lindala. Thanks for listening to the Lake Superior podcast.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?
And by the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation. As a nonprofit, we rely on support from listeners like you. If you like what you hear, please consider a donation. To learn more and make a gift, visit us at www.gosuperior.org.